Let's look at the example of why showing faraway tragic pictures of climate change impacts are not as influential as local urgencies. Okay, so this is a picture of a really emaciated polar bear on broken ice, and this started off as the poster child for global warming. The Arctic obviously is a hotspot for global warming. The disappearance of Arctic ice is being watched very carefully, and this is going to be a tragedy for many of the communities that depend on living there, hunting, and their livelihood, and of course polar bears and other species. But soon it became clear that while people may feel really bad about seeing these pictures, it doesn't always translate into action. Sometimes it does in terms of contributing to World Wildlife Fund or some other fund that helps with climate change action, but it doesn't result in sustained personal involvement and personal commitments and personal action. Right? So the key thing there to remember is that the change in attitude is not the same as change in the behavior. Okay, you may accept that climate change is now a serious problem and it is created by human beings, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to change your behavior in terms of reducing your consumption, your emissions, and your impact on the environment, or your general care for the environment, local or global. Okay, so going local and getting personal is important for changing behavior. Beyond changing attitude, it's important for changing behavior, which becomes very critical when you want real impact. So getting personal, is it possible to identify a lever to move people who are largely resistant to arguments based on science, ethics, or the public good? So we talked about the low-hanging fruit and the high-hanging fruit before. So this is kind of the high-hanging fruit. So can you get personal with those people, or are they so impenetrable, so skeptical or cynical that they just don't care? How do you rouse people from the status quo and move them to question political agendas and ideologies that deny the reality of climate change? This played out to such an extensive detail in the Trump administration that even environmental safety rules and regulations and implementations and enforcements were being nullified left and right. Huge new regulations were being allowed to let drilling happen in the Arctic, removing protection for endangered species, and so on and so forth. So how do you get those people to accept that this kind of denial of the reality of climate change is not good for anybody, for them or for the global community or for their local community? Is it possible to instigate a change in attitudes, norms, and behaviors? Norms are basically rules you follow, like stopping at a red light. There is ideas that humans are very good at internalizing norms. The example that's always used is that even if you're driving around at midnight in a small town and there is nobody around, no cop, and there is a red light and you are the only one in this four-way intersection, you would still wait till the light turns green before you go. Why? Because you've just accepted that you must stop at the red light. So how do you then instigate changes in the norms that relate to environmental impact of yourself and, let's say, your local community? So the book advises or advocates public health risk of a warming planet as one example which can bring everything to a local, personal level to induce not just attitude change, but behavior change. I hope this works, but we'll see how COVID played out in a minute. Okay, so this can be used to say climate change is impacting strokes, cardiovascular diseases, respiratory diseases, and make it clear that climate change will harm individuals all over the world. Is it so clear? Is it so obvious? Is it such an easy thing to do? I am not completely sure, because if you consider people who smoke, for example, they may know very well that smoking is bad for them, but they have an addictive behavior which is supposedly related to the way their brain is wired. But without going too far off, there are personal choices that are made that do not really care about their own health. Then the secondary smoking became an issue, regulations came along. Now it's very easy to ban smoking in restaurants and even in entire buildings and towns, right? It has been made illegal to smoke outside in many places, many cities even. So how do you bring about such change? Can climate and health become such a lever? This knowledge will give individuals reason to become personally interested in solutions. I hope this is true. So we have to convince everybody that health issues will affect all. So let's say that's a good metaphor for how to get local, how to go local and get personal. So these sorts of general figures exist: impact of climate change on human health, injuries, fatality. So you can start from here: climate impacts on temperature, extreme weather, rising sea level, increasing pollution. So go into severe weather, air pollution, and so on, and then talk about the diseases. But unless you make these very, very local, you may not have traction. So if you look at beautiful reports that get written every year by, let's say, the Lancet, Countdown on Health and Climate Change, ensuring that the health of a child born today is not defined by a changing climate, you have to have details like this. This is a map which has some granularity. Okay, this is showing potential full-time annual work lost in the shade and in the sun. Okay, so you can see that even in the shade, people working in agriculture, industry, and services like delivery, postal people, cleaning outside, building workers, construction workers, and so on. In the shade itself, the situation is pretty bad in terms of annual work lost. You can see the numbers here, less than 30 and so on, up to greater than 300,000. And of course in the sun it gets much worse. So you can see the hot places like Africa and India and parts of China and Indonesia and so on. Of course there are places where thick forests make a difference nonetheless. You can see that this is something that it can be made very, very local, and people do experience it. But on the other hand, if you look at what happened with COVID exploded as a pandemic and spread very fast, and the US is still struggling with the highest number of cases overall and the highest number of cases per day being recorded even now. So what is the perception there? Okay, people have issues with mandated mask wearing and social distancing, staying home for Thanksgiving, and so on, right? So the threat perception, emotion and risk perception, prejudice and discrimination, disaster and panic. Those are kind of the various steps of threat perception, and you can see the cartoon here of walking towards a cliff. And then leadership. What can it do? It can create trust and compliance, identity leadership, and in-group elevation. So this is again getting personal and going local. This is about using social and behavioral science to support COVID-19 pandemic response. So you think the problem would be more acute in countries that are developing, but instead in the richest country in the world, COVID seems to have exposed all these issues. So individual and collective interests are thinking about zero-sum game, moral decision making, and cooperation. And what about science communication? There's been maybe some missteps by the World Health Organization, but conspiracy theories exploded almost as immediately, saying Bill Gates created the myth of COVID-19 and that China is doing this. There's lots of fake news, persuasion. And the social context. What are the social norms? What are the social inequalities? And what is the culture? And what is the political polarization? Each of these social contexts played out in great detail in the US. Okay, so then comes the stress and coping, social isolation and connection that was created by the closing of the schools and universities. Intimate relationships were affected, domestic violence went up, healthy mindsets. So the point is that COVID-19 actually has been a good poster child for what climate action may end up being like, even if you get local and personal. Okay, so the economic impacts of COVID-19 obviously pushed all the climate action to the background. And now that we are going to come out of COVID-19 soon with vaccination and so on, at least in 1 or 2 years, let's say, what will be the priorities? It will be to bring the economy back to its full scale. Can green investments make this a synergistic climate-friendly investment in terms of creating employment, growing the economy without harming the environment? That needs to be seen, right? So this is a very good example of how there may be limitations of using health as a paradigm for getting personal and going local. Let's hope it works, but obviously it has a lot of work that has to be done.